Season 21 is less than 3 weeks away, so it's not surprising we're starting to get details regarding some of the changes, more so than the teasers we've already gotten. So this is essentially the full, or I wouldn't say full, but everything they're willing to tell us now about the abilities, supers, tuning, and basically just some changes happening that aren't weapons or armor. Now, going throughout, they give us a rundown of the things that they want to talk about, but we might as well go through things one by one. Skipping all of the reasons why, I'm just going to let you know what is happening. Now, they've increased essentially every aspect to a minimum of 2 fragment slots. Now, keep in mind, they are not committing to it permanently. This could change depending on how potent some builds become. But for hunters, the Trapper's Ambush, Shadow Dive, and Gunpowder Gamble aspects will have 2 fragment slots now. For Titans, the Bastion and Juggernaut aspect will have 2 fragment slots. And for Warlocks, the Chaos Accelerant aspect will have 2 fragment slots, mainly so you can have 2 additional perks to everything instead of just 1 in case you wanted to run any of these aspects on your classes. Now, going forward, they start hitting all the supers and the ways they're dedicating to the game. So, starting off, all supers generally have an increased PvE damage resistance by 20%. Basically, all supers are going to be a little bit tougher, mainly PvE melee supers, but you know, every super is going to be a little bit tougher in PvE, so endgame is going to be a little bit easier. Then going forward through each class and their changes. So Hunters, they're increasing the damage of Golden Gun in both of its varieties by 20%, and same thing with Arc Staff, an increase in damage by 20%. Then for Spectral Blades, they increase its PvE damage by 35%, now allowing the heavy attack to weaken targets on hits, and fixing an issue that causes some of the right-handed attacks to fail to connect when at a maximum attack speed. Then next for Gathering Storm, that's mainly a Crucible update it seems, basically making it so that direct impact damage versus players is increased from 200 to 300, I imagine to make one-shotting a tanky super easier. Delay the lightning strike damage versus players increased from 300 to 500. Lingering lightning tick damage versus players increased from 40 to 60. And now deals increased damage versus Well of Radiance and Ward of Dawn. And I believe this is to take it more in line with the Hunter's version of Nova Bomb, which originally was Blade Barrage, but it's hard to say officially. Then for Titans, they're changing some stuff up, basically in general. For Fist of Havoc, light attacks are going to be more potent and less costly per use. Same thing with heavy attacks. They increased its PvE damage of the heavy attack by 33%, and the heavy attack will now blind targets near the center of the slam area, so hopefully some increase in Fist of Havoc use aside from Code of the Missile. Then as well for the Glacial Quake on Stasis Titan, increases the Shiver Strike thrust speed while in the super by 10%, and increase the light damage by 20% for Glacial Quake. So hopefully that's a little bit more potent for Stasis Titan. Then for the rest of the Titan subclasses, the Sentinel Shield has increased damage by 20% in PvE, Hammer of Soul increased damage by 10% in PvE, and for the Burning Wall, you get an additional 10% damage in PvE, but now cast a Sunspot on cast with Soul and Vistas equipped, matching a Hammer of Soul behavior, and the Heavy Attack Cyclone will now apply Scorch over time. So hopefully you can actually get some ignition farming out of Burning Maul now. Then moving to the Warlocks. Increase the PvE damage of Nova Warp by 15%, and a fully charged attack will now make enemies volatile on hit, so expect all the ad clearing nowadays. And for Nova Bomb, another increase of damage by 20%, surprisingly. They don't specify Vortex or Cataclysm, so let's just expect for both of them. Now, for the Stormcallers, they're increasing the PvE damage by 25%. The damage ramp while attacking will now occur more quickly. Basically, you get to maximum damage at 3 seconds over 5. Then the Landfall Detonation and Seeker will now jolt targets as well, so hopefully there is more jolting going about. Then for Chaos Reach, the increase in damage of PvE by 25%. Sustained damage on a single target now creates a jolting lightning strike at the target's location, increasing damage resistance against players from 40 to 50%, so it's easier to survive in Crucible. The strafe speed while mid-super is increased, so a little bit speedier while moving, and adjusting the camera to avoid the players blocking certain views of targets while strafing. So, Chaos Reach could make another comeback again. Then for Winter's Wrath, they basically just increased its damage by 10% to PvE out of nowhere, considering I always thought it was already pretty great. And for Daybreak, they adjusted the super camera to allow the player to look down further and avoid visual effect blocking view of targets when moving too quickly. So, no change to Daybreak, just a little bit of an ease of use change. Now, some tuning for Strand, and some was already mentioned, but I guess this is the rest of them. Now, going into it, the Hunter's Threaded Spike increases projectile travel range before returning by 30%, increases damage versus PvE combatants by 55%, slightly reduces the speed of the dart as it returns to make catching it easier, increases energy gain for catching the dart based on the number of enemies hit, and will now pierce failing shields and no longer prioritizes the catch animation over the grapple animation if an enemy target is within grapple melee range. So, there you go. For Titans, the Frenzy Blade, I'm not sure exactly what that means by it, so bear with me. They decrease its cooldown stat based on how many melee charges you have stored. And it says at 0 charges, the cooldown is reduced by 15%, and at 2%, or at 2 charges, is reduced by 30%. I think what it's telling us is that your charge when you have a few charges is going to be faster than if your charges were empty. Which, that's what I'm understanding. It could be the other way. I'm not entirely sure I understand this, but the same goes for the Arcane Needle attack on Warlock Strand. Basically, same thing exactly. And then increase the projectile speed based on the projectile's flight time. Initial velocity is going to be 40 meters per second, up from 30, and final velocity will increase to 70 meters per second, up from 60. And they increase its tracking strength by 10%. Now, grapple is something we've known about. The base cooldown is being reduced by practically 22 seconds. And the minimum time between grapple activations is down to pretty much it can be used back to back if you so require it. Now, the threat generation, no nerf generally, but they reduce the energy provided by some damage over time mechanics, and also reduce the energy generated by trace rifles by 36%, because I think those were outliers in terms of using it and abusing it. Then into more broad spectrum. Now, for stasis tuning, the Hunter's Withering Blade will increase projectile tracking strength range on bounce versus players by 20%, and increase the maximum tracking strength by 12.5%, I guess to make them a little bit more potent. For the Shiver Strike itself on Titans, the maximum thrust while flight is increased by 16%, decreasing maximum downward influence of gravity while in flight by 18%. I think so Shiver Strike can fly more. And Howl the Storm, that increased the width of the freezing cone versus players by 31%. And the Warlock Frost Pulse will now provide 2 meters of additional melee lunge range after activation for 1.2 seconds, in case you guessed. Or, actually, I think I know why. But then, next up, the basic light classes tuning. Now, going for the Titans as well. Seismic Strike, Shield Bash, and Hammer Strike, basically all of these sprint to melee things, will now cost 15% of your melee on activation, regardless of whether or not you hit something. So, it makes it so that you can't use it as a permanent move thing in the Crucible. But now, base cooldowns are standardized at 91 seconds, down from 101 or previously ranged from that range. And now they also made it so that if you have higher strength, you'll basically have it back every 7 seconds. So think of Shiver Strike, or think of all the shoulder charge abilities to a mini movement ability like Thruster. You just have to have the strength build up to use it. Now, they're also making adjustments to some other things. Now, in PvE, Knockout for Arc Titans. Lunge range is going to be reduced from 6.5 to 5.5 meters, reducing, I'm assuming, some Crucible screwiness. And then Uncharged Melee against PvE damage will increase from 60% to 10%, so your base melee bonus is going to be improved. Syntheseps builds come back, maybe? And then for the thrown melees on Titans, the Shield Throw, they increase the base damage impact from 60 to 70, and the consistency of finding and adjusting initial trajectory towards new targets after a bounce is increased, allowing to hit more, and the throwing hammer will now adjust its initial flight trajectory based on the aim assist target. Now, there is something else changed for Sol Invictus as well, increasing the damage dealt by sunspots to any player per tick from 17 to 12, so sunspots are a little more lethal in the Crucible. And for Hunters, the Snare Bomb increased PvE weakened duration on detonation, double the amount of time all the way up to 8 seconds. The knives are being adjusted, which I'm not going to really understand why, but proximity explosive knives detonation damage versus players is reduced from 105 to 90, and the impact damage versus players increased from 14 to 20. So basically, 15 less damage here, 6 more damage here, slightly less damage overall. And the weighted throwing knife on mouse and keyboard reduces minimum tracking shape size by 25% and maximum tracking shape size by 10%. The shape grows over 0.5 seconds after the projectile is thrown. I guess more tracking the longer it's flying. And they're trying to bring lightweight knife into play by increasing its projectile speed from 30 meters to 40 meters per second and increasing its tracking shape size. Which, Come on, Bungie. You have the knife that explodes, the very big high damage knife, and then you have basic baby knife. I get you're trying to bring it in line, but no one, and I say no one, uses it. Don't try to make the others worse and make that one better, just make the others better. Please. Then, aside from that, they also reduced the activation time between Gunpowder Gamble from 12 to 6 seconds, so if you want to boom, that is probably going to be your best bet. Plus, double fragment slots, so you might actually be able to use it. And for Warlocks, they are generally improving other things. The Incinerator Snap, they fixed an issue for it, preventing the secondary projectile aiming shape while activating, but they also reduced its damage versus players from 150 to 135 to compensate for increase in consistency. Basically, let's say it sends out a fan of 5 projectiles. They improved its consistency for those 5 projectiles so they all might hone in on one target, but because that might be overly lethal, they are basically reducing its thing so it doesn't overkill somebody. Now for the Ball Lightning on Warlock Arc Melee, increases PvE damage by 30% and reduced ping scalar on both primary and secondary detonations, so combatants are less likely to be knocked out of the secondary strike area while the player is amplified. Now, as well, they're changing some things on Chaos Accelerant and Void, so basically, while you're running Chaos Accelerant, a overcharged scatter grenade will have increased tracking of consistency of charger scatter grenade submunitions, increased submunition arming duration, and fix a bug where some submunitions were impacting to the ground on creation in some situations, resulting in early detonation. And for the magnetic grenade becoming a handheld supernova, they increased the charge time hold from 3.2 seconds to 4.5 seconds. Now, Lightning Surge, which I forget what this is, I think it's a hunter thing, I forget exactly, but fixed an issue allowing Lightning Surge to deal more instances of secondary strike damage than intended. Now targets can take a maximum of 2 instances of damage from a single activation of the ability. One of the primary lightning strikes around the player, and one from the secondary lightning strike. This change necessitates some changes to damage values, but in general, its damage output should be significantly more consistent and slightly higher than intended value previously, but with the ability to one-shot a single enemy in Guardian from full health. Now, changing some tunings from keywords, basically. Scorch will now last more often, and will, or how do I say this? The increased stun time before stacks begin falling to players. Okay, so generally Scorch will do the same amount of damage more often before it steadily trickles down and does less damage over time, making it so that Scorch actually deals generally more damage. And what people were probably hoping never happened, but did because of how much they've been using it, Jolt is being nerfed, reducing base PvE damage by 15% and reducing additional damage scalar versus major combatants in PvE by 20%. Basically, if you want to know why, they think Jolt was making it too much as a alternate ignition just for arc, so they're making it a little bit less damaging to hopefully create it as a more, instead of an explosion, a chain of damage to the area. Now they're also adjusting arc speed booster for amplified. The bonus jump acceleration scalar reduced so you don't jump straight up, but now activates while sprinting after 2.5 seconds down from 3, and now lingers while the player is not sprinting for 2 seconds up from 1.5. It also fixed an issue where the bug, if the player is already sprinting and became amplified, the booster would not be granted. But that is the last thing, but it isn't a complete list of changes coming. That's just everything they're telling us so far, so stay tuned for the full list of patch notes on launch day in case anything here is shown or not shown that they just did anyways. With that, personally, I'm not surprised at the amount of, well, I'm kind of surprised at the amount of buffing. I'm not surprised at Jolt's nerf, but I am surprised that generally they are trying to bring some things that are just never recommended or never used into the limelight, because that's just kind of how things are. Like, buffing the lightweight hunter knife? Who would imagine? Every other knife is practically better. But, aside from my opinions, that is everything I got for you right now. My name is Ben Scorpion, and I will see you in the next video.